Marcus had always prided himself on being an active and involved owner of his diner, but over time he had started to feel disconnected. He trusted his managers to handle things, but he wondered if they were really telling him the whole truth about what was happening in his restaurant. Were his employees genuinely happy? Was the food quality up to his standards? And most importantly, how did they really feel about him as a boss? The questions lingered in his mind for weeks, and he decided it was time to find out for himself. He didn't want to rely on reports or secondhand information anymore. Marcus knew that to understand what was truly happening in his diner, he needed to experience it from the perspective of a regular customer, so he decided to go undercover. He would step into his own diner without anyone knowing who he really was. Dressed in casual clothes with a hat and sunglasses to mask his identity, he knew this would be the perfect opportunity to observe his staff without them knowing they were being watched. It wasn't just about seeing how the food was prepared or how the staff worked behind the scenes. It was about understanding the atmosphere, the attitude of the employees, and their level of respect for the diner. Was everyone working together as a team? Was the customer service up to his standards? And most importantly, what did his employees think of him? Marcus felt that his position as the boss might have clouded their true opinions of him. As the owner, people tended to either respect him out of duty or fear, but now, he needed to know if that respect was real or just out of obligation. When he arrived at the diner, he took a deep breath before stepping through the door. The familiar buzz of activity, order tickets, printing, the sizzle of food on the grill, the chatter of customers, immediately welcomed him. The place felt comfortable and alive, but something felt different too. He walked up to the counter, where two cashiers were chatting quietly. They greeted him with a polite smile, not recognizing him as their boss, which was exactly what Marcus wanted. He ordered a simple sandwich and sat at one of the tables near the back of the diner, keeping his head low and his face mostly hidden by the brim of his hat. At first, everything seemed fine. The staff were moving quickly, and the diner felt like it was running smoothly. He observed how the waiters and waitresses interacted with customers, noticing the politeness and efficiency with which they took orders. The food was coming out at a decent pace, and the kitchen seemed to be in good rhythm. But as he sat quietly, taking in the atmosphere, a strange feeling washed over him. Something about the employees' interactions with each other didn't sit right. Marcus watched as the two cashiers exchanged small talk while they worked. He didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just typical chatter between coworkers. But as the conversation shifted, he started to hear things that made his stomach churn. The two employees were talking about their boss, and although Marcus couldn't see their faces, he could tell from their tone that the conversation wasn't one of admiration or respect. In fact, their words felt like daggers aimed directly at him. "Can you believe he thinks the diner's doing well just because he owns it?" one of the cashiers said, laughing under her breath. "He barely even comes in anymore, just leaves everything to the managers. I'm not sure he even knows what's going on here." Her colleague snorted in agreement. "Yeah, and if he does show up, it's always to check the books or collect the cash. I don't think he has any clue what the customers are really like, or how hard it is for us to keep things running smoothly." Marcus's heart sank. He didn't want to believe what he was hearing, but it was becoming clearer by the second. The two cashiers were essentially mocking his lack of involvement in the day-to-day operations of his diner. They were laughing about how disconnected he was from the reality of the business, and worse, how little they thought he cared. The words cut deeper than Marcus had expected. He had always tried to be a hands-off boss, giving his staff the freedom to do their jobs without micromanaging them. But now he realized that this distance had made them view him as a passive owner, someone who was out of touch with the true workings of the diner. It wasn't just that they felt he didn't understand the challenges they faced, but they seemed to take pleasure in the fact that he was unaware of the problems they were dealing with. He had wanted to experience the diner from the perspective of a regular customer, but he hadn't anticipated hearing such harsh criticisms. The employees didn't seem to see him as someone who was invested in their success, or someone who had a genuine interest in the well-being of the diner. To them, he was just the man who signed the checks, the face on the business cards, but not someone who was truly part of the team. Marcus was hit with a wave of emotions: disappointment, frustration, and a deep sense of betrayal. How had he allowed this to happen? How had he let his staff think so little of him? He had always believed that his efforts to create a positive work environment would shine through, but now he was forced to confront the truth. That his staff didn't see him as a leader but as an absentee owner, someone whose role was limited to the financial side of things. The realization was difficult to process, and for a moment, Marcus considered leaving the diner and confronting the employees immediately. But he stopped himself. He wanted to understand more, to get the full picture before making any decisions. He didn't want to make a rash judgment based on a few overheard comments, no matter how painful they were to hear. As he sat there, lost in thought, his sandwich arrived. He barely touched it, his mind racing. He had come here for answers, but what he had uncovered was more than he expected. He realized that his next steps would require careful thought and a deep look into the dynamics of his diner. The issues he overheard weren't just about disrespect. They pointed to a larger issue: his inability to stay connected with his employees and his business. He had seen the diner from a distance for far too long, and now he was faced with the challenge of rebuilding trust, communication, and respect from the ground up. The atmosphere of the diner, as Marcus sat quietly observing from the corner booth, seemed like any other busy lunchtime rush. The hum of conversation, the clinking of cutlery, the sizzling sounds from the kitchen, everything appeared to be running as it should. The employees moved with the rhythm of a well-oiled machine, taking orders, delivering food, and managing the flow of customers. On the surface, it seemed like his diner was a success, just as he had hoped when he first opened its doors. But as he watched more closely, his satisfaction began to fade. The two cashiers, positioned near the front counter, were engaged in a low conversation, their voices barely rising above the hum of the diner. At first, Marcus didn't think much of it. Small talk between co-workers was nothing unusual in a busy environment like this. But then he began to catch bits of their words, and what he heard made his stomach churn. One of the cashiers was telling the other about how little they were paid, and how their hard work often went unappreciated by the management. It wasn't the kind of complaint that could be easily dismissed as a casual gripe. It was the kind of deep-seated frustration that reflected a lack of respect, not just for the job, but for the leadership in place. The cashier spoke bitterly about the boss, not realizing that Marcus, their boss, was sitting right in front of them. "He thinks we're doing fine just because he owns the place," one cashier muttered, stirring the coffee in front of her absent-mindedly. "The truth is, we're the ones keeping this place together. He doesn't even bother to check in on us, he only shows up to collect his paycheck." Her words hung in the air, and Marcus's heart sank. He had always been proud of his approach to management. He prided himself on trusting his team, giving them the freedom to run the restaurant without constantly hovering. But now, sitting in the quiet corner of his own diner, he realized just how wrong his assumption had been. He had removed himself from the daily operations, thinking that his leadership and occasional visits were enough. But to his employees, it seemed like his absence had bred contempt. The other cashier nodded in agreement, laughing lightly as she added, "Yeah, he's never around. And when he does show up, it's just to ask about the money. He's always been all about the business side of things. I don't think he knows or cares what's actually going on here. We do all the work and he gets all the credit." Marcus's face flushed. He had built the diner with so much passion and effort, pouring his heart into every corner of it, believing that his vision would be enough. But to hear this, hear his staff talk about him as a distant, uninterested figure, cut deeper than any criticism he had ever received. At first he wanted to confront them right then and there, to rip off his disguise and show them exactly who they were speaking about. But then he stopped himself. He needed to understand more. He needed to see how deep this resentment ran and how much of it was rooted in genuine frustration versus simple gossip. He didn't want to jump to conclusions based on overhearing a few moments of conversation. So he decided to remain silent, watching and listening, letting them reveal their true feelings. The comments didn't stop there. They continued. And the more Marcus listened, the more he realized that what he was hearing was not just dissatisfaction with his absence, but a deeper critique of his entire leadership style. One of the cashiers mentioned how they had been forced to deal with difficult customers without enough support, complaining about management's failure to address the issue of poor customer service. "He doesn't care what happens as long as the money comes in. If the customers complain, it's on us, not him," she said bitterly. Marcus couldn't believe his ears. Was this how his employees truly felt? Had he become so disconnected from their daily struggles that they had started to feel like he was no longer a partner in the business, but an absentee figure whose only concern was the bottom line. It was a painful realization for Marcus, one that made him question everything he thought he knew about the diner and his role in it. By the time his sandwich arrived, he could hardly stomach it. The words from the two cashiers lingered in his mind, drowning out the clinking of plates and the laughter of customers around him. He had spent years building this restaurant, and now it seemed like his efforts had been in vain. It wasn't just the fact that they had criticized him. It was that their frustrations went unheard. They didn't feel seen, respected, or valued. The trust he had assumed existed between him and his employees had apparently been broken long ago. His initial instinct was to walk out, to leave the diner and pretend that the conversation had never happened, but that wouldn't solve anything. The truth, as uncomfortable as it was, had been laid bare before him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His leadership had failed. He had built the business, yes, but had he built a culture of respect and teamwork? Clearly not. The disconnect between him and his employees was more than just an issue of being out of touch. It was a fundamental breakdown in trust and communication. Marcus left the diner that day with a heavy heart. The world outside seemed brighter, the streets busier, but inside him he was consumed with thoughts of how he would address the truth he had learned. He wasn't sure how he would confront it, whether it meant a hard conversation with the employees, a complete overhaul of his management style, or something else entirely. What he knew for sure, though, was that something had to change. If he wanted his diner to succeed, he would have to rebuild the relationships with his staff from the ground up. It wasn't just about fixing the operational issues. It was about earning back their respect and trust. And that would take more than just being present in the restaurant. It would take a deep and honest reflection of himself as a leader. The days following his undercover visit were difficult for Marcus to process. The weight of the overheard conversation hung heavily in his mind, gnawing at him relentlessly. What he had hoped would be a chance to check the pulse of his diner and its operations had instead exposed a deep, underlying issue, one he hadn't been aware of, but which was now impossible to ignore. The anger, frustration, and bitterness his employees harbored had been building for months, perhaps even years. It was like a silent undercurrent that had quietly eroded the respect they once had for him. What struck Marcus the most was not just the employees' complaints about his absence, but the tone in which they spoke. There was no sense of loyalty or camaraderie in their words, only resentment. He had always believed that by giving his staff autonomy and stepping back from micromanaging, he was fostering an environment of trust and independence. Instead, he had left a vacuum, one that his employees had filled with dissatisfaction and a sense of abandonment. The realization stung deeply. His absence had been interpreted as indifference. He had believed in giving them the freedom to operate, but to them, it had come across as a lack of interest, a lack of leadership. He could hardly focus on anything else for the next few days. The usual hustle of managing his business, checking inventory, balancing the books, and reviewing customer feedback, felt trivial in comparison to the deep issues he now faced with his employees. He had spent so much of his time on the financial side of things, assuming that as long as the numbers looked good, everything else would fall into place. He had underestimated the importance of emotional connection, communication, and leadership. As the days passed, Marcus became obsessed with understanding exactly where he had gone wrong. He replayed every interaction he'd had with his staff in his mind. Had there been signs that things weren't as they seemed? He thought back to the casual conversations he had had with the managers, the ones where everything seemed fine on the surface. They had been polite, respectful, even complimentary. But now he wondered if those were just empty words to mask the dissatisfaction bubbling under the surface. Marcus had never received any direct complaints, but then again, he realized that perhaps no one felt comfortable coming to him with their concerns. Why would they when he was never around to truly hear them? His role had been that of a distant observer, someone who handed out the paycheck but didn't engage with the heart of the operation. That night, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen but not really seeing anything. He felt an overwhelming desire to fix things, to make things right, but he didn't know where to start. Should he address the two employees directly? Confront them about what he had overheard? The thought of putting them on the spot made him uncomfortable. He wasn't sure if it would be the right approach. No, he realized he couldn't make judgments based on one overheard conversation. It wasn't just about confronting the two cashiers. It was about digging deeper, understanding the root causes of their discontent, and addressing the broader issues that had led to this breakdown in trust. The next morning, Marcus decided to take action. He called an impromptu meeting with his managers, the ones who were in charge of overseeing the daily operations. He needed their feedback. He needed to understand whether this was an isolated issue or something that went deeper within the company. The meeting was tense, with everyone a bit hesitant at first, unsure of where things were headed. "Listen, I'm aware that I've been distant lately, and I've heard some concerns about the way I've been managing the diner," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with a mix of vulnerability and resolve. "I've prided myself on giving you all the space to do your jobs, but I realize now that I may have been too hands-off. I need to know what's really going on here. What's the feedback from the staff? How do they really feel about the work environment and my leadership?" There was a long silence. The managers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to respond. Finally, one of the senior managers, Carla, spoke up. "Marcus, I think we all appreciate the freedom you give us, but sometimes it feels like you're not really present. It's hard to know what direction we're supposed to go in if we don't get guidance. Some of the staff feel like they're left in the dark. They don't know where they stand, and it leads to frustration. It's not just about what happens on the floor. It's about knowing you're invested in the bigger picture." Her words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on creating an independent, efficient team, but now he understood that independence had to be paired with communication and connection. He had taken a hands-off approach, believing his staff could thrive on their own. But in doing so, he had overlooked the need for regular check-ins, feedback sessions, and clear communication from leadership. His employees didn't need his micromanagement, but they did need to know he was there, that he was invested in their success and the diner's future. The conversation continued, with the managers offering their own insights and suggestions on how to improve the team's morale and productivity. Marcus listened carefully, taking notes, realizing that the solutions weren't complex. They just required his presence, his engagement, and his willingness to lead in a way he hadn't before. He had been so focused on the financial side of things, but leadership required more than just balancing the books. It required emotional intelligence, empathy, and the ability to connect with those who made the business work on a daily basis. That evening, Marcus made a decision. The next day, he would take a more active role in the diner. He would begin by talking to the employees, one-on-one, to hear their concerns and feedback. He would start holding regular team meetings to check in with them, not just about their work, but about their experience at the diner. He would make sure they knew he valued them, not just for their labor, but for their ideas, their feedback, and their well-being. As he sat in his office that night, reflecting on the changes he would make, Marcus felt a sense of determination. The road to rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. His diner wasn't just a business, it was a community, and if he wanted to lead it successfully, he needed to be present. The days of being a disconnected boss were over. It was time to rebuild, not just the operations of the diner, but the relationships that made it thrive. The next day, Marcus woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. After his meeting with the managers, he realized that change was long overdue. The conversations he had overheard and the feedback he had received made it clear that his diner was not just a business. It was a reflection of his leadership, or the lack thereof. He had always thought that stepping back would empower his staff, but now he understood that real empowerment came from involvement, from showing up and engaging with his employees on a deeper level. As he walked into the diner, he took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. Today was going to be different. The diner was busy as usual, with customers coming and going, orders flying out of the kitchen, and the staff bustling around. But despite the usual noise and activity, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of tension in the air. He knew the employees, especially the two cashiers, were still unaware of his identity as the boss. He had decided not to reveal himself just yet. Instead, he wanted to observe them again, but this time with the knowledge of their thoughts, to see how they interacted with one another and with the customers. His first stop was behind the counter, where the two cashiers, still unaware of who he was, greeted him as they would any other customer. He smiled at them, trying to keep his identity hidden, but the words from yesterday's conversation echoed in his mind. They still acted polite and professional on the surface, but their body language seemed off, and there was a noticeable gap between the warmth they showed to customers and the coldness they exhibited toward each other. The thought crossed his mind that their negativity wasn't just directed at him. It had likely seeped into how they treated each other and the overall atmosphere of the diner. Marcus didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't help but notice how the employees behind the counter seemed to avoid eye contact with him. They didn't smile as warmly as they did with other customers, and there was a sense of discomfort in the air. The awkward silence between them told him that something had shifted in the relationship. He could sense it. They knew something had changed, and he was no longer just an anonymous owner. The deeper he looked, the more he saw. There was a lack of camaraderie, a lack of unity among the staff, and that was something he couldn't ignore any longer. He decided it was time to engage directly. Walking up to one of the managers, he asked to speak privately. They went into the back room, away from the commotion of the diner. Marcus had always respected this manager for her hard work and leadership, but now, he needed her input more than ever. "I've been thinking," Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with a sense of urgency, "about how things have been going around here. I've heard some things and I don't like what I'm hearing. I want to know how the staff really feels, and I need to make some changes." The manager hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure how to respond, but then, after a brief pause, she spoke candidly. "Marcus, I think you've been a little disconnected from the staff. You've been a great boss in terms of running the business side of things, but the people here, your employees, they need more than just orders from the top. They need someone who's there with them, guiding them and showing that you care. There's a sense of frustration building. People feel like they're working hard, but that they're not seen, not valued." Her words hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. He had always thought he was doing the right thing by giving his team autonomy, but now he realized that he had been absent in ways that mattered. Leadership wasn't just about delegating responsibilities and checking in once in a while. It was about active engagement. It was about making sure your employees felt supported, heard, and appreciated. "What do you think I should do?" Marcus asked, genuinely wanting to understand the steps needed to fix the rift between him and his team. The manager paused again, clearly thinking carefully before responding. "Start showing up, Marcus. Be present. Not just for the big meetings or when there's a problem, but every day. Talk to the staff, hear their concerns, get involved. If they see you're invested, they'll be invested. They need to feel like they matter to you, like they're part of something bigger than just a paycheck." Marcus nodded, taking in her words. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Changing the dynamics of his diner wouldn't happen overnight, and he was going to have to work hard to rebuild the trust that had been broken. But he was willing to do it. He had no choice. As the day went on, Marcus decided to take small, deliberate steps. He started by talking to the kitchen staff. He wanted to know what they thought of the food, the operation, and how he could help make their jobs easier. He found himself getting involved in conversations he had avoided in the past. He asked the cooks how they were doing, listened to their feedback about the menu, and expressed his appreciation for their hard work. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small effort to show them he wasn't just the guy who signed the checks. He was their boss, and he cared about them. Later, Marcus called another meeting with his staff. This time, he was not the faceless owner watching from behind the scenes. He was in the room with them, looking them in the eye and telling them how much they meant to him and the business. He admitted his mistakes, his absence, his failure to recognize the importance of being present, and promised that he was going to change. He asked them for feedback, for ideas on how to make the work environment better. He wanted them to know that their voices were heard, that their contributions mattered. The room was silent at first, but as the minutes ticked by, the tension began to lift. One by one, employees began to speak up, offering suggestions, sharing frustrations, and expressing their hopes for the future. For the first time in a long time, the team felt like they were part of something. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where they had a say, where their efforts were appreciated. The journey to rebuilding trust was just beginning, and Marcus knew it would take time. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had taken the first step, not just by listening, but by showing up. And in that moment, he realized that leadership wasn't just about being at the top. It was about being there with your team, every step of the way. The next day, Marcus woke up with a renewed sense of urgency. The weight of the previous day's conversations, both with his manager and his staff, was heavy on his mind. He knew that acknowledging his mistakes was only the first step. The real challenge now was following through on his promises. Words alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild the trust he had lost. It would take consistent actions, a visible effort on his part to prove that he was more than just a distant boss who signed checks and expected results. It was time to make his presence felt, not in a controlling way, but in a manner that showed he was genuinely invested in the success and well-being of his employees. He decided that the best place to start was with a simple, direct approach. He wasn't going to make grand gestures or empty speeches. Instead, he was going to lead by example, showing up in ways that mattered and making his employees feel heard, valued, and supported. It was time to break down the walls that had formed between him and the team. Marcus spent the entire day in the diner, not as the owner in the back office, but as someone who was part of the daily rhythm. He started with the kitchen, where the heart of the business lay. He had always respected the cooks and their craft, but this time he was determined to make a real connection with them. He watched as they worked, expertly flipping burgers, chopping vegetables, and running the line with precision. It was clear they were dedicated, but there was something missing in their interactions with him, something that spoke to their lack of trust in his leadership. As he stood there, observing, Marcus realized that he had been absent from their world for too long. He had always assumed that if the kitchen was producing great food, everything else would fall into place. But he hadn't spent enough time talking to his chefs, learning about their challenges or understanding their perspectives. He walked up to one of them, a quiet but skilled chef who had worked with him for years, and started a conversation. "How's everything going back here?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone casual but sincere. The chef looked up, slightly surprised by the question. "It's good, busy as usual. But sometimes we feel like we're working with one hand tied behind our back. It's hard to keep the kitchen running smoothly when things are always changing up front. It's like we're expected to keep up with the rush, but we don't always get the support we need." Marcus nodded, taking in the feedback. He had never fully considered how disconnected the kitchen was from the front of the house, how the chaos in one part of the restaurant could affect the flow of the entire operation. He had assumed that things were fine as long as the orders were being fulfilled. But the truth was, the disconnect between the kitchen and the front of the house, and the lack of support and communication between departments, was a silent but critical problem that was affecting employee morale. "Thanks for being honest with me," Marcus said. "I want to do what I can to make things better for all of you. I'll make sure we address this. Whether it's more help up front or clearer communication on how we're running things, we'll get it sorted out." For the first time in a while, the chef smiled, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. "Appreciate it, Marcus. It means a lot that you're here and asking." Marcus moved from the kitchen to the dining area, walking through the restaurant to see how the front-of-house staff were doing. As he passed through the busy room, he noticed the small things, the strained expressions of the servers, the hurried movements of the hostesses trying to keep up with the demands of the customers, the quiet frustration in their eyes. These were the people who interacted with the customers day in and day out, and yet they seemed just as disconnected as the kitchen staff. He spotted one of his best servers, Carla, who had been with the diner since it first opened. She was balancing a tray of drinks while trying to manage a large table of customers. Marcus walked over to her and casually asked, "How's it going, Carla? Everything okay?" Carla didn't immediately respond. Her attention split between taking orders and delivering drinks. After a moment, she glanced at him and sighed. "Honestly, it's been a lot harder lately. The pace is fast, and sometimes it feels like we're just putting out fires. There's not enough communication between us and the kitchen, and customers can feel it. We try to keep it together, but when the orders start stacking up, the stress is intense." Marcus listened carefully. He had always thought of Carla as someone who had it all under control, someone who was always professional no matter the situation. But now he realized that the stress she was under was a sign that something was wrong, something deeper than just the usual diner rush. There was a systemic issue with the way his restaurant was being run, and it wasn't just affecting efficiency. It was affecting the morale of his employees. "I get it, Carla," Marcus said. "I'll work on improving the communication, and I'll make sure you and the kitchen are on the same page." You shouldn't be dealing with this kind of stress on your own. She nodded, her eyes softening as she appreciated his genuine concern. Thanks, Marcus. It really does mean a lot. By the time Marcus left the diner that evening, he had started to see things more clearly. He wasn't going to fix everything overnight, but the first steps toward real change had been taken. It wasn't about fixing the kitchen or the servers or the cashiers individually. It was about changing the culture of the entire diner, creating an environment where employees felt heard, valued, and supported. The experience of overhearing his employees' frustrations had been painful, but it had also been an invaluable wake-up call. Marcus knew that to lead effectively, he had to be present, not just physically, but emotionally. He couldn't lead from the back office anymore. He had to lead from the front, working side by side with his team, supporting them, learning from them, and building a sense of trust and respect. That night, as he sat in his office, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow he would start again, not just as the owner of the diner, but as a leader who was fully engaged in every aspect of the business. He would make sure his employees knew that they were not just workers. They were part of a team, and together, they would rebuild the diner into something stronger than it had ever been before. The following day, Marcus woke up early, determined to put his newfound approach into action. The weight of yesterday's realizations still hung over him, but he was no longer paralyzed by it. Instead, he felt an invigorating sense of purpose. He had uncovered the cracks in his leadership, and now it was time to mend them. He wasn't going to wait around for things to get better on their own. He knew that change would only come if he took proactive steps to create a shift in the diner's culture. One conversation, one decision at a time. As he walked into the diner, the familiar hustle and bustle of the morning rush greeted him. It was a comfortable chaos, something he'd come to expect. But this time, Marcus wasn't going to be a bystander. He was going to be part of the action, and he knew that the first thing he had to do was address the staff. With a quiet sense of resolve, he called a staff meeting in the break room. The room was filled with the usual chatter as the employees gathered: waiters, cooks, dishwashers, cashiers, and even the managers. They all looked at him with curiosity, some with skepticism, unsure of what to expect. After all, it wasn't often that Marcus called for a meeting outside of the usual schedule. The air was thick with anticipation, and for the first time in a while, Marcus could sense the nervous energy among his staff. "All right, everyone," Marcus began, standing in front of them, his tone calm but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about where we are as a team. I've heard a lot from some of you, and I've also heard things that I didn't expect to hear. Things that made me realize I've been absent in a way that I shouldn't have been. I haven't been as involved in your day-to-day work as I should be, and for that I want to apologize." The staff went silent, their eyes fixed on him. Some of them exchanged uncertain glances. Apology wasn't something they had expected from him, not in the way he was speaking. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He wasn't here to justify his behavior or make excuses. He was here to own it. He had failed them as a leader, and he needed them to know that he was ready to make it right. "Moving forward, I'm not going to be a stranger in this restaurant anymore," Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I'll be here in the thick of things, working with you, not just overseeing. We're a team, and if we're going to succeed, we all need to be on the same page. That means communication, open, honest, and consistent. It means respect, both from me to you and from you to each other. And it means accountability. We all need to hold each other to a higher standard." The room remained quiet, but there was a shift in the energy. The skepticism began to fade, replaced by something else, cautious optimism. Marcus could see it in their eyes. They were waiting for him to follow through, to prove that he wasn't just offering empty words. And Marcus knew that actions would speak louder than anything he could say in this meeting. "I'm going to start by getting more involved in what happens here every day," Marcus said. "I'll be working alongside you during peak hours, handling some of the smaller tasks you might need help with. Whether it's running food, taking orders, or just talking to customers, I want to be part of the action. I'm not asking you to do anything I'm not willing to do myself. Let's create a space where we all feel valued and heard, not just the customers." He looked around the room, making sure to meet the eyes of each person. "This is your diner as much as it is mine. I'm here to support you, and I expect that from you too." If you have concerns, I want you to speak up. Don't wait until it's too late." The room remained silent for a few moments longer before the tension finally broke. One of the younger servers, a girl who had been with the diner for a few months, spoke up. "I think that's the kind of leadership we need," she said, her voice a little shaky but strong. "We've all been feeling like no one's listening. But if you're really here to help, then we'll give it a shot." Her words sparked a ripple of agreement, and slowly, others began to voice their thoughts. Carla, the server who had been with Marcus for years, nodded and added, "It's not about money or business. It's about respect. When we feel like we're respected, we give our best. We just need to know you're here for us, not just for the bottom line." Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The conversation was no longer just a one-sided speech from him. It was a dialogue, an exchange of ideas, and a promise for the future. The staff had spoken up, not with anger, but with honesty and a desire for change. They weren't asking for miracles. They just wanted to feel valued and heard. The meeting continued, and Marcus found himself listening more than speaking. He asked for feedback on everything, from the menu to the work environment, from the communication between departments to the general mood of the staff. The more he listened, the more he realized how much work had been left undone. There were small adjustments that could make a huge difference, but there were also larger issues of morale and trust that would take time to heal. When the meeting ended, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The tension had been replaced with a sense of purpose, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he was part of the team again. Not just the boss, but an equal. He made a mental note to follow through on the changes he had promised. His employees had been given a voice, and now it was his turn to prove that their concerns mattered. As the day unfolded, Marcus worked side by side with the staff, helping where he could and talking to the customers in between tasks. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was a start. He wasn't just showing up physically, he was showing up emotionally, mentally, and as a leader. And as he looked around the diner, he felt a sense of pride. It wasn't the shiny new equipment or the polished floors that made the place work. It was the people. And he was ready to earn their trust again.